70 high schools for blacks in the entire South. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida. That's very interesting. But, you know, and then I'm going to bring Utrice on. Why that was important? Because there was only 4 high schools in Georgia for blacks in 1900. There was only 4 public high schools for blacks in Georgia in 1900. And it always interested me. My mother graduated from McClellan Academy. She graduated from McClellan Academy. And in the year of her graduation, there were no black men in her class. All right? There were no black men in her class at McClellan Academy in the year of her graduation. And McClellan Academy was financed 100% by black folks in the community. All right? That's how serious our people were about education. And I was fortunate enough to see the school before it was torn down, McClellan Academy. And it was a boarding school to boot, because most of these people lived out in the country. So you couldn't go from Newton 20 miles every day out in the country on a mule and wagon. So we were not fortunate enough to have cars then. As a matter of fact, in many instances, you couldn't own a car because of the sumptuary laws. See, the sumptuary laws said that Negroes can't live out of their place. White man caught you in an automobile, they put you behind bars. If you were driving anything but a mule and a wagon, you was in big trouble, because you had violated the sumptuary laws, because you were living beyond your means, which is you were living below the lowest white person. See, when you were growing up in the South, you had to first find out the poorest cracker in the community. And then you had to live below the poorest cracker. All right? All right, you had to live below the poorest cracker. If you were found living beyond the poorest cracker, you was in big trouble. All right? So you had to first find who the poorest cracker was in your community. And then you had to live lower than him. Otherwise, you was out of your place.
Yes, sir.
So this is the legacy that we have to deal with. And that's why we deal with these programs and these questions, because there's so much to our history that you don't even get. But now, we got somebody here that's going to make sure that we get how to read between the lines correctly.
All right, sir.
And there's nobody else better to do this than the 1995 recipient of the William Leo Hansberry Award of the United African Movement, and that is Sister Utrice Leid. Let us all stand up, please, and give a warm round of applause to our sister, Utrice Leid. Let's give it up for Sister Utrice Leid. Even got Hilly Sanders out here tonight. Brother Barty ran in here. Y'all put the baskets up at the back to make sure the Hillis Sunders and Barty put something in the basket on their way out. Richard Barty is in the house. I am so pleased to introduce this sister this evening. But before I do, and I'm going to put her right at the microphone, Utrice, but if I don't do this now, because of my rising age, I might forget this, and I don't want to be criticized. I was given a note indicating there's an affair that's going to happen this week, and this sister, in whose honor this affair is being given, is someone that we all owe a round of commitment, and even if I can't be there for long, I'm certainly going to go by there myself on behalf of the United African Movement, because she comes in the same spirit as Utrice Leid, and that is Sister Camille Yarborough. Yeah. Sister Camille Yarborough. And they're going to honor her at the Ben House, Dr. Ben House, this Saturday. That's the 27th of January, 1996, 726 St. Nicholas Avenue at 7 p.m. They're going to honor Camille Yarborough, motivator, inspirator, and activist, this coming Saturday. And certainly she is someone that we all owe a great deal of respect to, because she comes in the same spirit of Utrice Leid. They're always there. Whenever you need her, she's always there. Very community-oriented, a community inspiration. And so we all going to let forth our community perspiration. Barty, I heard you on radio. I'm trying to be just like you. I'm working on being a poet like you. And so you see I'm getting my rhymes right. Inspiration, perspiration. Certainly, we're all going to be out there for her, perspiring and all, this Saturday night at Dr. Ben House, 720 St. Nicholas Avenue at 7 o'clock p.m. That's Camille Yarborough. Try to get the word out. Let everybody know. If you're fortunate enough to be on radio, mention it there as well, so that the community can truly come out and honor this sister in a very big way. I wish I had this announcement today when I was on Imhotep's program, but I certainly hope that somebody will call Imhotep tomorrow and remind him. That's 726 St. Nicholas Avenue. What's the cross street? That's about 146, 147? All right, the court is 726 St. Nicholas, between 146 and 147. It's on St. Nicholas, between 146 and 147. And that's this coming Saturday night at 7 o'clock at Dr. Ben's house, Camille Yarborough. And now with no further ado, I don't have to introduce her to anybody, I don't have to present her to anybody, and there was nobody that was psyched out tonight. Utrice, about OJ, they all came out to see you. All right? They came out to see a queen, not a sellout. All right? That's a big difference. They came out to see a queen. They were not going to waste their money watching a sellout. And so let us all again give a warm round of applause for our sister, one who we love so much, our teacher, Sister Utrice Leid.
Wow, it's good to be home. Well, we're going to do some reading tonight, but we're going to do some reading of a different sort. The idea is to read between the lies. It's a defensive mechanism, a mechanism of defensive reading. You know how good drivers are taught defensive driving? As a consumers of information, you have to do defensive reading, defensive hearing or listening, defensive viewing. And you have to do that because You have to understand, and I know you do, that this thing we call the media is really an extension of a white racist society. Its aim and objective largely, supposedly, is to inform. But the assumption there is that you're worth informing. You're not. Not as far as they're concerned. So things come our way. And with technological advances, they're coming our way faster. And so the power to discriminate is thwarted sometimes because things are happening so quickly. You're forced to react at the pace at which they're presented to you. So you don't have time to do really intelligent and cognitive reception of information. You just take it all in. And at some point, maybe something would register with you. Maybe a second thought would occur to you. Maybe an apprehension will surface. But it is not always the case. And we have to be particularly careful about media because we know the link between information and power. I talk about that all the time. Sound information is the key to power, and therefore the absence of information or unsound information or disinformation or misinformation or no information is key to powerlessness. So with all that, we will begin our lessons for tonight. Everybody has some literature, I hope. And we will start with the story, a New York Times story, titled "Faulty Application of Paint is Cited in Stairwell Fires." Faulty application of paint is cited in stairwell fires. You have that? Okay. Is this visible? Oh, I gotta turn the lights on. Is it better? Okay, good. I'll give you about a fast 5 minutes to peruse the article. Alton section of the New York Times on January the 22nd, 1996. What you need to know is we'll talk about the aesthetics of the article. By the aesthetics, I mean, what is the treatment given this article? As you look at it, what strikes you about the article, just without even reading it? You'll notice, for example, that it is a two-deck headline, which means that it is pretty important, a pretty important story. You'll notice also, because I clipped it with that in mind, you see those two lines at the top? It is at the top of the page, which is to say, this is a pretty important article. It is placed at the top so that your eye can catch it right away. It is on page B2, which is a pretty important page. It is the first page on the inside as you open up the metropolitan section. So in terms of position, the idea is to communicate to you that this is a very important story and you ought to read it. Again, the lines at the top, the placement, the actual physical placement of the article toward the top part of the paper, you have, and by the top part of the paper, because you know the New York Times is what is called a broadsheet. That is to say, it's a big paper. So at the top of the paper means even if you folded the paper, it will still be at the top of the paper. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. And it has a double headline, 2 lines. You'll notice also that there is a little thing called a pull quote that says, stairwell walls in arson fires had been improperly sanded. See that? That there is your pull quote, a pull quote, which is a phrase or a sentence or a couple of words extracted from the body of a story to augment the story, to highlight an important point of the story. But this pull quote says that the stairwell walls in arson fires had been improperly sanded, and that appears in one of the paragraphs. It's extracted from the paragraphs. So that's the aesthetic of the story. I didn't measure the story, but it looks like about 12 column inches in length. In other words, it's just 12 inches long. I would estimate this to be about what? 6 inches, 2 columns by 6 inches. That's pretty sizable for a little story. Now, what did you notice about this story? What is important to pay attention to is the last paragraph. Because that's where the story is. Responding to an article in the Daily News saying that the Housing Authority continued to use oil-based paint until last January, despite warnings from fire officials. You understand that? That's where the story is. That the city continued to use unsafe paint. It has nothing to do with the sanding of the walls. And you would notice that this fatal fire, which caused all of this controversy, occurred on December the 22nd. That's in your second paragraph. A great effort here is to set you up. In the first paragraph, the reporter says that the issue you ought to pay attention to is that fire and housing authority officials have finally solved the problem. They've analyzed what went wrong. They know what went wrong. And what went wrong was that the paint was improperly applied. They've solved the problem. This is very affirmative, very good news. And it is stated in the headline that it is almost a finding. A finding has been arrived at that the faulty application of paint is what the problem is. Okay, let's concede that. But that is not the story. The story is that despite the finding, they continued to use the same paint. And it doesn't take a genius to figure this out as the angle for a story. They've already found something. They've already determined what the issue is. But what I'm trying to show you here is how this reporter and the paper this reporter worked for chose instead to position the city in an affirmative light, despite the fact that it should be held accountable. Let's take a look. Look at the tone used in the first paragraph. Fire and housing authority officials said yesterday that they had determined what went wrong in efforts to protect. You see that word? To protect New York City's housing projects from a terrifying series of stairwell fires, and would complete the work in the most susceptible buildings this week. Now, after you read a paragraph like that, what registers? These are deliberately, carefully chosen words. They have determined it. In other words, they've conducted an aggressive investigation and there is a finding. They've determined what went wrong in efforts to protect New York City's housing projects. Now, I don't want to cast any aspersions on people, but it is not normally the expectation that any city official is interested in protecting people from anything. This reporter takes on the job of insisting that the fire commissioner and the housing commissioner are in the business of protecting people in the projects. And so that word is in there. Now, it may seem to you that I'm making a big fuss over a word, but I'm saying that the tone of the paragraph is already conciliatory. It is not about subjecting anybody to scrutiny. It is to excuse or to explain or to rationalize their inaction, because if they were interested in protecting people, then how do we explain the last paragraph? See? So, look at paragraph 5. The paragraph beginning with Ruben Franco, my main man. That paragraph. Quote, "We think that we're in control now." Ruben Franco, chairman of the Housing Authority, said yesterday at a City Hall news conference, quote, "We're on top of this, and we're moving very aggressively and very effectively." Now, if I were to write a press release, I couldn't have done a better job. The housing commissioner, the guy who still can't explain why the housing authority was using oil-based paint a full month after a fire, and after repeated warnings that this paint was susceptible to just going up in flames, is quoted unchallenged, saying they're on top of things. They got a handle on this. Everything is under control, because he is protecting these people in the projects. And now look at the very last sentence of this story, in which Franco is quoted as saying, quote, "At the time, obviously, we thought we were moving as fast as we could move." A contradiction. But the reporter doesn't see it as a contradiction, and the editor who edited this story doesn't see it as a contradiction. This suffices as reporting for the New York Times, the paper of record. Look at the paragraph 8. The fire commissioner says, yes, they're doing these things to make the city's housing projects safe. But most importantly here, the fact is these buildings do not start fires by themselves. These are arson fires that are started by criminals who intend to start dangerous fires. You're blaming the victim. Let us say we go along with that quote. Look at the stupidity of the paragraph that follows it. Mr. Franco said the housing authority had hired hundreds of teenagers to help police officers patrol inside buildings and to look for the debris in stairwells that could be used to start fires. If these arson fires are started by criminals who intend to start dangerous fires, why are you hiring teenagers to supplement a police force to go out there and find out these dangerous criminals, identify these? You see how stupid this all is? And it doesn't once occur to this reporter from the New York Times that any of this is out of whack. The reporter doesn't say, well, wait a minute. You hired hundreds of teenagers to run around patrolling the halls to spot arsonists who may be armed, and you're interested in protecting people. You love these people so much that you're going to put teenagers at risk. Police officers are armed, and you are going to hire hundreds of teenagers to supplement police activity because you love people so much. Now, another way of reading a story is not only to pay attention to what is said, you pay particular attention to what is not said. And in that regard, we look at who is not in the story. Who is not in the story? There isn't a single tenant in the story. There is no tenant quoted in the story. There's no tenant organization quoted in the story. There's no housing organization quoted in the story. Every single source is an official source. You have the Fire Commissioner Howard Safer. You have the Housing Commissioner Ruben Franco. And that's the extent of the official explanation of the story. There are no ordinary people here. The reason being that they are not equipped, you see, to talk about fires in the places that they live. They don't qualify as being important enough to discuss this last paragraph, which is where the story is. Any smart editor would say, you haven't written a story. This is a good outline for a story, and now with this outline, you go and write a real one. So the story is in the last paragraph. The story is organized in such a way as to take the city off the hook. The story does not confront. Instead, it is conciliatory. It leaves out the people living in the projects, and it accepts stupidity as rational explanation. When a housing commissioner could say, we are interested in protecting the people of the projects, oh yeah, I know we used the paint way beyond the limits, and yes, we ignored the warnings about the oil-based paint, but we really like the people in the project. And we're on top of this, everything is under control. Don't worry about a thing. And this is from the New York Times. Now, when you read this story, if you were to read the story quickly, you'll come away with the feeling that everything is all right. And here at last, the city demonstrates the ability to solve a problem. But of course, it hasn't solved a problem. And the agent that should be confronting the city about the fact that it is delivering a snow job here is instead colluding with it. It is agreeing to distort the reality of where the story is. So now we take a look at that pull quote again in relation to the headline. And we see that if we just glanced at this story without even reading it, between reading the headline and reading the pull quote, we would have surmised something approximating the thrust of the story. And even so, it is inaccurate. So they're saying if you didn't have time to read the story, you read the pull quote, you read the headline, you've gotten the gist of it. That the faulty application of the paint is a problem, and the problem further is that the walls were not sanded. And that's all you need to know. We'll take a look at story number 2. School's boss speaks, but few understand. Do you have that story? Oh, we'll get to it. We're coming back. School's boss speaks, but few understand. From page 11 of the New York Pest. Now, there are a couple of things you need to know. Again, we go back to the treatment of the story. Let's look at the aesthetics of the story. You see, of course, that I left the folio or the date and whatnot at the top, just to give you a sense that this was at the top of the page. It's a right-hand page, page 11, and it's on the top, which means as you open it, your eyes fall right on the story. You'll notice a couple of things about this article. Again, a double-decker headline. So this is a pretty important story, and it is understood that you're going to read it because they've positioned it that way so you can read it. It is really one long story. Well, not so much long, but it's about, I'd say a good 8, 9 inches or 10 inches or so of copy to one side. And there is this thing. That shaded area is called a sidebar. So you have a sidebar which is tinted to give it more attraction and more presence on the page. So in the sidebar, also you have a reverse headline. That is to say, normally the type would be black on white. When it's reversed as it is here, it appears white against a black background. That is to make your eyes go straight there and to hold your attention, to get your attention. And so in this sidebar, we have a lot of graphic activity. We have a photograph, and you would see that he is lifted out of the photograph because they wanted to just get him. You'll see a microphone in front of him, and his mouth, Rudy Cruz's mouth, is positioned in a way that he's talking. He's actually talking. And you would see that the headline says, "A Guide to Crew Speak." So the photo fits the idea of this man talking. And you will see in that portion that is highlighted repetition. What he says, what he means, as a kind of subheads. And you will see that the type even is different. Do you notice that? The type style is different. It is different from the type style in the story, because it is meant to have an entirely different treatment. Although it is related to the story, it is also intended to stand alone. So you have the what he says in what they call a sans serif type. That's type that goes straight up and down with no little things on it. So you have what he says, what he means, and then lines. A line appears, which means they're introducing little segments of little blurbs to catch your attention. And then there's a glossary. At the bottom of his photograph, there's a headline, again in reverse type, saying glossary. So it's a kind of reference guide. Now, so we have a treatment here of a story that picks up a pretty sizable presence on a tabloid-sized page. Remember, the New York Post is a tabloid. And this story would take up a substantial portion of page 11, as it in fact did. We have the main story augmented by a sidebar with all kinds of graphic things happening there. The idea is that this is a very, very important story. But is it? Let's deal with the headline. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, you notice that the byline, that's the line that says who the story is written by, the byline says it's by Lawrence Goodman. And the tagline under Lawrence Goodman says that he is the education reporter for the New York Post. So this person is someone who specializes, someone specifically assigned to cover education. This is a person who has serious authority about education. So as we take in all of this, we drink in all of this, the aesthetics of the article, we are prepared for something. We set up for something. School's boss speaks, but few understand. The story in no way suggested that a poll was taken. You understand what I'm saying here? When you have somebody contending this kind of headline, somebody's saying something but few people are understanding what the heck this guy's talking about, I expect, how many people did you talk to? How many people did you pose this question to? And of the 5,000 people that you polled, what percentage of those 5,000 people said they could not understand, which will give you the authority to write a headline like this? But this is an arbitrary act. They can say few understand, and they can say few understand because Lawrence Goodman doesn't understand. And when Lawrence Goodman doesn't understand, few understand. You understand the arrogance here? Lawrence Goodman has a problem understanding Rudy Crew. Lawrence Goodman transfers his inability to understand and makes it a national agenda. Because he doesn't understand, it is to be expected that few understand. And nowhere in this article does he qualify the few. Nobody conducted a poll. Nobody from the Post conducted a poll to find out how few are few. And how come this is even an issue? Why is this an issue? And now for some objective reporting. Just read the first sentence. Is school's Chancellor Rudy Crew the Yogi Berra of the city's education system? My question is Lawrence Goodman for real? This is reporting? This is an editorial. It has no business masquerading as a story because it is an editorial opinion. It has no business in the news section of any paper. Any story that starts out, is school's Chancellor Rudy Crew the Yogi Berra of the city's education system? Who the hell is this guy to even pose this question? I'm not even a card-carrying member of the Rudy Crew fan club, but we dealing fair is fair, and fact is fact. And journalistic professionalism is professionalism. You can't tell me you're a reporter and your first sentence is an editorial comment. If you are in the business of commentary, you should be in the op-ed section of the paper. And here's what is so insidious and so pernicious about this stuff. Rudy Crew and Yogi Berra a man with a doctorate in education equated with a baseball guy. I'm not making judgments here, but you understand the analogy. Is Rudy Crew the Yogi Berra of the city's education system? And right away, the reporter insists that this is a joke. This article is really a joke, a cynical joke. People are coming away from his speeches with a burning question. What the hell is this guy talking about? Which people? Which people are coming away? No, Lawrence Goodman is coming away with a burning question. From his speeches. How many speeches? What's the context of these speeches? But you see the arrogance. The headline, few understand. The very first words of the article saying, Rudy Crew is a joke. And the ensuing paragraph affirms this man, this Goodman's arrogance. And this is journalism, allegedly. What the hell is this guy talking about? Would he ask that question of Giuliani? What the hell is Giuliani talking about? What the hell George Pataki is talking about? What the hell was Ed Koch talking about? But listen to the language. What the hell? Not what the heck, but what the hell is this guy talking about? Lawrence Goodman is offended. Crew speak. In the very next paragraph, he gives it a name. He coins a phrase. Crew speak is a hodgepodge. And he ought to know it's one word, not hyphenated, of jargon, tortured phrases, and malapropisms. Look at the three sentences we've been treated to so far. None of them are connected, and all of them are definitive editorial comments masquerading as journalism, masquerading as reporting. But in each instance, it is Lawrence Goodman's personal appraisal being offered in the form of, quote, people are saying and few understanding. Now, this is as basic as it gets. This is vitriolic stuff. Consider his opening remarks. He's making a case against Rudy Crew. He's telling you, listen, this guy, this black guy, he can't talk. I think he can't talk. I think he doesn't make sense. And I want you to consider my point of view. Because after all, I am the education reporter. I know about education. You notice, nothing here is dealing with education so far. Mr. Goodman disapproves of Dr. Rudy Crew's speech patterns. And disapproving of his speech patterns, he has singularly come to the conclusion that Rudy Crew is not fit for the job. And the proof of the pudding was yesterday, where Mr. Goodman followed up with a so-called exclusive on the fact that Rudy Crew intends to root out racist teachers from the classroom. Now that's what's really bothering Lawrence Goodman. So he offers this thing, which, as you read it, actually is very funny. Not unlike, say, Dan Quayle, who said that he's prepared for any eventuality which may or may not occur. Now, would Lawrence Goodman have asked, what the hell is that guy talking about? And he was vice president. We don't know, reading the story, one, whether these quotes are accurate. We don't know the source of the quotes. We don't know the circumstances of the speech. But we are to believe Lawrence Goodman's interpretation of the world. This is the world according to Garp. We have to believe what he says. Because after all, he is the post-education reporter. I read it actually as post-education. Post-education. Later on, you'll get the joke, you'll laugh. But he makes an interesting case here. He cites these silly things. And listen, I want to listen to how these words register. Crew's spokesman, Dave Beagle, said it's okay if the head of the nation's largest school system violates the rules of grammar. So Rudy Crew apparently is to be held accountable for the fact that he violates the rules of grammar. So what really is the issue here? Is the issue that Goodman doesn't understand, or Goodman is from the Society to Protect the English Grammar and finds that Rudy Crew's grammar so violates the rules of grammar that he shouldn't have his post? What is the problem? He's dancing around it. We know the problem, don't we? We know the problem. But this is how they broach the issue. So far, nothing in this story relates to education. Nothing in this story has anything to do with reading scores, math scores, teacher performance, underperforming schools, none of that. These are incidental. The major problem, you see, is that Rudy Crew violates the rules of grammar. And then he says, arrogantly again, in the story, a post-analysis. An analysis of 3 of Crew's speeches, which he delivered extemporaneously, revealed these rules of Crew speak. You understand the enormity of this? You really have to get a grip the way these people believe that they have the singular authority to define the world and what matters in it. The Post conducted an analysis. 3 speeches are enough to warrant an analysis by the New York Post. And the paper admits that these speeches were delivered extemporaneously, that is, without notes. We don't know what kind of speeches they were. Were they thank you speeches? Were they, yes, I'm glad to see you speeches? Were they, I'm glad for this award speech? I'm here to testify speech? What kind of speech? And it revealed these rules. Now, Rudy Crew may never have thought that he had rules when he writes his speeches or when he delivers speeches extemporaneously, but Lawrence Goodman has arbitrarily decided that there are now rules to this thing that he has coined called Crew speak. You know, just compounding, just driving this thing. Quote, say the same thing in as many ways as possible and make up words and use jargon. Now, taken in its totality, doesn't this article make the best argument about the level of education in the education reporter? This education reporter cannot distinguish fact from fiction and substance from fluff. And then he goes to the side. You see, this is all a big joke. This is how they use time and space. The idea is to undermine Rudy Crew. And the idea is that this paper, for whatever reasons, I would suspect that the reason is its incestuous closeness to City Hall, has decided that Rudy Crew needs to go. He needs to go. He was behaving, but now he's showing signs, ever so small signs, but they're signs of rebellion. He has fussed about the $164 million cut that Pataki is taking. He's fussing at the looming budget, the $2 billion hole that Rudy Giuliani has to fill that would necessitate further cuts in education. And now he's talking about making teachers sensitive to the majority African American and Latino kids in the school system. You can't have that. So whereas David Dinkins was reduced as the man who wore nice clothes, Rudy Crew is reduced as the guy who can't talk straight. Not a single thing in this article has to do with the thing that Rudy Crew is best at, which is education, reportedly. It has to do with what he says. The author doesn't make a distinction. I should say the writer. I mistakenly said the author because it is fiction, so I used it that way. But the writer of the story is given full permission. And as you go back, you see, what is the few? Go back to the headline. What few people understand, you never said. Your story doesn't say who is misunderstanding Rudy Crew. Not one person in this story is quoted as saying, I don't understand this guy. It's not necessary, because Lawrence Goodman doesn't understand, and that is enough. Lawrence Goodman has the chancellor's spokesman explaining why it is he didn't get a point, or why the chancellor may have sounded rather clumsy in the way he phrased things. But everybody knows, if you know anything at all, there's a vast difference between the spoken word and the written word. Lawrence Goodman has not asked for any of Crew's written speeches. Rudy Crew fails Lawrence Goodman's personal test from his spoken words, not his written words. You see, he can't fight with the written words. He could fight with the spoken words. And we still don't know whether these things are accurately reported or not. Now, a further note about what he says and what he means. This is another way of saying, you know how black folks talk sometimes, the jargon, that word, jargon. And he's translating black talk into regular talk. He takes it upon himself to do that. What Rudy Crew, this pretender, this nigger pretending to be an educated person, this is how he talks. And this is what he ought to say. This is what he really means. And that, we know, is what the message is here. That Rudy Crew, in the eyes of Lawrence Goodman, is a nigger with a PhD. And sitting in his office, he is able to decide arbitrarily what standard ought to be operative here, what level is to be expected of a chancellor, and he can write an entire article and be given all this space to drive home the point to the people who read this paper that what we have in the chancellor is a nigger with a PhD. And as a cynical joke, I'm going to tell you what this guy says. I'm going to tell you what he means. I'll translate for you. He said, by the way, that it's characterized by malapropisms and hasn't cited one. Because, of course, Lawrence Goodman doesn't know what a malapropism is. And then he gives these jargon pieces here, the storming mode and renorming and infrastructural transformations and readiness skills and so forth. All this just to make the point that Rudy Crew is to be perceived as a buffoon, as a poser, as a fake, a fraud and a phony, as a nigger with a PhD. And that's what this story means. Masquerading innocently here as journalism. You understand? So when people read this story, the next time Rudy Crew appears and he's talking about expectations and empirical measurements for performance, everybody's going to say, that guy's funny, man. You know, that's the same guy who the Post wrote about. He talks funny. I don't know. I don't know about this guy. He can't grasp these complex issues because he can't talk. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because this was an example of how media organizations accomplish an insidious objective by putting all the credence in the tag names, you know, Lawrence Goodman, the post-education reporter, all this phony parading of credentials, basically still dealing with an unidentified objective, although we know what it is. The objective is the New York Post has declared war on Rudy Crew, and he is now going to be the target of the unrelenting criticism to the point where they will frame or reframe and recast the debate. The article that appeared, also authored by Goodman yesterday, dealt with this horrible turn of events, this horrible, horrible situation in which the chancellor will soon demand that teachers respond non-racially, or she said non-racistly, to their pupils. And this is intolerable. This is not to be countenanced. And the New York Post has begun this process because, you know, the New York Post, being as sensitive as it is, has a fully integrated newsroom and is very sensitive to diversity, as you well know. So I wanted to bring this to your attention. Let's go to another story. And the third one we'll deal with. Rikers guard busted. Feds target many others. Again, the aesthetics, which we pay attention to always. You'll see that this story begins on page 2, which is the first inside editorial page of the paper, and it appears in the Daily News main section, page 2. It appears, of course, I indicated the line, you see the folio, which is the line that gives you the page number on the top, to indicate that this story appeared at the very top third of the page, which means that they intended this to get your attention because they considered this a very important story. You'll note, of course, that the story is in a box with a pretty substantial rule around it, and it is continued on another page, on an inside page, page 24. You'll see that it is a double-deck headline, Rikers guard busted, which is a pretty substantial headline, and feds target many others, which is a very catching continuation. You'll see that the dead center in the third column of this story, right under the headline, the second headline, you see that little box that says Daily News Exclusive, which means that they're breaking a story. They have this, and supposedly nobody else has this. This is a story that the Daily News believes it and it alone had, which is another way of saying somebody gave the paper information sooner than it gave it to anybody else. You'll notice that 3 people are credited with the byline here: Greg Smith, Joe Calderone, and Mark Mooney. 3 reporters worked on this story. It is unclear who actually wrote the story. 3 reporters reported on it. We don't know who wrote the story. So it might have been that the reporters called in the story, or the reporters worked on different aspects of the story, and that somebody else was responsible for writing it, or they may just have worked on the story, filling in different parts of the story all along. So we are unclear as to whether the reporters who reported the story also are the writers of the story. All right. What is important about the story, of course, is that as an exclusive, you'll see the word sources appearing quite frequently in the story. You see that? It appears in the first paragraph of what sources said is the start of criminal charges. In the second paragraph, the sources said federal and Bronx prosecutors. It appears also in the fourth paragraph, criminal indictments which the sources said. It appears in the sixth paragraph, sources said several correction officers. It appears all the way through the story, because that's the nature of this kind of story. Basically, they were handed information from the inside. They didn't say well-placed sources. They didn't say sources within the criminal justice system or sources within the FBI, or they didn't identify any more definitively where these sources came from, but they're said to be sources, and the word sources is all over the story. Which is to say that to some degree, as the reader of this information, the implication here is that you will go on blind faith, that these sources are authoritative. The sources quoted in the story are authoritative sources. They're not identified by name, and so we don't have a point of reference as to where the information is coming from. That is the way the reporters chose to protect the source of the information, or the sources of the information. But what is important about this story, the really important part to me, actually appears on the continuation, not in the box. The continuation is where the story is. And if you look in the continuation of the story, you would see this line, which appears quite incidentally. The twin probes began after a class action civil lawsuit was filed by inmates of the segregation unit in 1992. Now, that's where I would start with the story. This is, after all, 1996. I will also start, the story is reported as a straightforward thing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested one guard, and you can pretty much determine that by his name, he be black. All right. So we have the name of Roger Johnson. Roger Johnson is the point man of the moment. And Roger Johnson was arrested. Now, as I read the story, it occurred to me, why are the feds involved in this case? The feds don't really have jurisdiction over the New York City Corrections Department. They don't run the city jails and state penal institutions. So why would this story totally steer away from the Giuliani administration and its culpability? I mean, Giuliani came in when? 19 what? He has had ample time to visit this suit. He has had ample time, the way they rooted out the Dirty 30. Why can't the city police itself? Why is it that inmates had to skirt around the city and its apparatus and instead plead for relief at the federal level? That's a big story. It is clear that these inmates filing an action in 1992, at least up until 1992, there must have been documented instances of clear-cut abuse. We know that because we know how many inmates die behind bars or are severely beaten behind bars. We know of the level of criminal activity behind bars. I mean, just recently, as you saw in New Jersey, the state had to take over a prison in order to root out corruption there. So it's not news to people in the corrections business that correction officers very often attack prisoners and inmates. But the story is situated again affirmatively. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is doing its job. It has quietly arrested a city correction officer. When we really need to understand why it is that this law and order, this get tough mayor, doesn't have a handle on a situation. You understand? Why don't we see the Daily News saying to the city administration, how come the FBI has to come in and arrest a correction officer, a city correction officer? What is that saying about the level of performance within the City Department of Correction? At a time that you're merging police forces and you're talking about efficiency, because certainly if these inmates win, that's a multi-million-dollar settlement. It's going to cost the city money. So in as much as it could cost the city money when inmates are harmed, and because you're so interested in law and order, and because you want to root out criminal conduct within the law enforcement community, how come the feds in 1996 are coming into your city prisons to arrest your city correction officers? You see, these questions are not asked because the reporters, and it took 3 of them to report the obvious. Not one of the 3 was in a position to say, well, look, we know that this is happening, somebody is arrested, but now we need to make a call down to the city. There is no comment from City Hall. You know how Mr. What's his face, we just left, Goodman, called up the chancellor's spokesman to have him account for his grammar. The Daily News did not call up a spokesman for the mayor to account for this federal arrest of a city correction officer. Giuliani's out of the picture. He's held harmless here. He has no accountability. His administration is not at all involved. And although the Daily News is positioning itself as affirmatively reporting information, giving you a great exclusive, it still intentionally omits the obligation to train the light of scrutiny on the Giuliani administration, and how the City Department of Corrections apparently has been failing, and apparently has been failing for a long time, to correct a situation. Now that is the role of good journalists. But those questions are totally missing from here. Totally missing. The idea is that the city's mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, is to be held above the fray. He is not to be challenged. He is not to be implicated. He is to be seen as the guy who is putting New York City firmly on the map. And it took 3 reporters, and heaven knows how many editors, to present this non-information. And look at the extent of it, you see? If it were just one correction officer, we say, well, all right. But look at what they themselves report. As many as 36 correction officers, including 15 captains and an assistant deputy warden. They have also notified the city attorneys, that is to say the City Corporation Council, which is the lawyer for the city. Anytime the city is being sued, they represent the city in such matters. And they say here, these 3 reporters, that the city attorneys have also notified 43 officers, including 6 captains and several wardens, that they will not represent them in court. And still nobody asks the question. I just threw out some numbers. I mean, they reported the numbers. Obviously, they understand the enormity of the situation, and still nobody asks, what is the role of the city here? Why is the city unaccountable? Why is the City Department of Corrections not now a major scandal? Why isn't Rudolph Giuliani and Bratton and whoever else is responsible in this merger mania that just occurred? Why aren't they responsible for the conduct of police and correction officers? I mean, they reported it. That they reported the numbers, and they reported the level of the problem. And this obviously is just the tip of the iceberg, but nobody questions City Hall. Finally, let's take a look at this story. Man is shot to death by police officer. It's a pretty long story. But there's something very, very important about it, and we'll talk about that in about 3 to 5 minutes. Okay. Man is shot to death by police officer. Questions arise in slaying after robbery at Polo Grounds houses. Again, page B3, which is a right-handed page, and you'll see that there are 2 photographs here. One is of the mother of the dead man's child. I don't know if it was his wife. I really am not clear about that. But she is holding this child, and they're supposedly surrounded by friends. And the bottom shot is of the dead man, Leonard Lawton. So we have 2 photographs, which is a sizable thing for the New York Times to do. They both pick up pretty interesting space. They organize, as you can see, to fall on the outer part of the page, which means your eyes definitely catch these 2 photographic images. And we have the headline and a subhead. We have a double-deck headline. Man is shot to death by police officer. Questions arise in slaying after robbery at Polo Grounds houses. Now, again, look at the headline and you see the attempted connection. Man is shot to death by police officer. Questions arise in slaying after robbery. Now, technically, as you read the story, you see that it is important, but if you just read the headline, you would be inclined to think that the man also was the robber. Okay. Now, it's a pretty substantial story. A lot of space. But again, here's what we look at. For the most part, this story relies on one official person, Chief Joseph R. Leik. And Chief Joseph R. Leik is all over the story. And basically the story is, and it's kind of fuzzy as to really what happened. Even the reporter indicates there's some confusion. But what is the crux of the issue is whether the police officer who allegedly shot this man to death did so with just cause. And we have an attempt in the story. In fact, it's a clear-cut explanation by Chief Leak that he did so within established police guidelines. Now, what I wanted you to pay attention to was where the story is hidden here. And where do you think the story, the actual story, is hidden? You have a lot of stuff to wade through. I'll cut it short and tell you. It's in the 16th paragraph. And it is a kind of innocuous sentence. In and of itself, you wouldn't think very much about it. But that's really where the story is. The paragraph reads as follows. Officer Vargas, a 10-year veteran of the Housing Bureau, had not spoken to detectives about the shooting as of last night, police officials said. You understand that paragraph? Now, why did I say that that is where the story is? No. The 48-hour rule. Now, when did this shooting occur? It occurred Saturday night. We're reading this Monday. And as of last night, the officer who allegedly committed this shooting was not questioned by detectives. Although, officially, Chief Joseph Leak already knows the facts. You understand how silly this is and incongruous this is? The man who did the shooting, the man who everybody agrees is the officer who fired the gun that killed Leonard Lawton, he hasn't said a word. But already Chief Joseph R. Leak, an African American incidentally, knows, one, that this was done within acceptable police guidelines, and more than likely was an understandable shooting. Unfortunate though it may be, but certainly quite well within the guidelines. And he makes statements as if he knows the facts of the case. But it says right there that the officer has not yet been questioned. An incident occurs on Saturday night that costs a civilian his life in highly contentious circumstances. And as of the writing of this article, which is published on a Monday edition, as of Sunday night, this detective has not yet been questioned. Now, I don't need to tell you what would happen if you were in similar circumstances. Well, you know, yes, I know I killed my neighbor, but I am indisposed at the moment, and I would prefer to talk to you, say, next Wednesday at 2:30, perhaps at Sylvia's restaurant. That doesn't fly. But this officer, who allegedly has murdered a man who was said to be unarmed, who witnesses said was reaching up, not down into his waistband, and who was killed. This officer, having dispatched a human being from the face of this earth, has not yet been questioned. And it is buried in an innocuous sentence in paragraph 16. And for the New York Times, the questions that arise The questions that arise have to do with the account of the event, not the fact that this police officer is enjoying temporary immunity from prosecution and from investigation. The article embroils you in the logistics of it. You know, who saw what, who said what, whose version applies, whose version is more accurate, what the chief of the housing chief is saying, what other people are saying, and so forth. And yet, the critical question here is, how is it possible for a police officer to kill someone and still not be subject to inquiry a full 48 hours after this event? How is that even possible? The truth is that this protection is what the city negotiates with the police officers union as, in fact, a job benefit. They are given immunity from prosecution. They may legally resist any attempt at all to be questioned or to be accountable for their actions. They have the legal right to not talk to anybody, even God himself. They don't have to answer questions for 48 hours or 2 working days, whichever works to their advantage. And very often, this rule, in fact, it is always invoked, especially in contentious circumstances where people are killed mistakenly, in error, as a result of poor judgment, whatever. And hidden in paragraph 16 is where the story is. And you notice the words they use. This is not a killing, this is a shooting. Leonard Lawton wasn't killed. In the story, he died after he was shot once in the face. That's a far more palatable way, isn't it? This man wasn't killed. He died. And this was not a killing by a police officer. This is not a shooting death even. They just call it a shooting. And we have, again, the chief speaking quite authoritatively about facts that are not yet known. And he's quite clear, even as the New York Times, and the Times reports this stuff, not even making the connection. This reporter hasn't yet said, well, wait a minute. Now, if the officer who was involved in this killing was not questioned yet, how do you know the facts? How do you know the full circumstances of this event? And how do you know them to the extent that you can vouch that this killing, this shooting, was well within police guidelines? He says here, Chief Leik said, Officer Vargas had information that a gun was used in the reported robbery and that the officer had grounds for expecting that the suspect was carrying a gun. Except, how was it determined that Leonard Lawton was a suspect? How you do that? He says, I would have thought that the person may have been armed, Chief Leik says, and he gives the rules. He gives an explanation. Just before that paragraph, that sneaky paragraph where the story is, the paragraph above it, the paragraph above it is the stinking, reeking paragraph. The rules of firing a weapon are when you feel that your life or the life of another is in danger and there is no other reasonable means to stop the person, the chief said. He has already concluded that the police officer's life was in danger. The same police officer who hasn't said a word. He has concluded that there are rules to firing the weapon and that it may not involve just the officer, but if somebody else. So if Vargas thought, for example, his partner was in danger, according to Chief Leid, he acted appropriately. And that there are no other reasonable means to stop the person, such as saying, stop. Now, this story I tried to bring to your attention because it is where there is a clear-cut unwillingness to ask the right questions. How is it possible that in this tragic circumstance where a civilian has lost his life, no matter how contentious the circumstances, no matter if it turned out that Leonard Lawton was in fact a suspect, or that Leonard Lawton was in fact reaching, even if Leonard Lawton was reaching for a bazooka, it still does not explain the crystal clear problem here that a full 48 hours after the shooting, the person committing the shooting is immune. He is not to be questioned, and he can resist any kind of investigation, no matter where it comes from. And nobody could compel him to cooperate. Nobody. For 48 hours or 2 working days. Now, the reason I brought these 4 stories to your attention, and I'm going to wrap up and see whether your comments or questions, whether you have any, is that I wanted you to start thinking critically about the information you're receiving, because it isn't always information. Sometimes it is an agenda. Sometimes it is deliberate omission. Sometimes it's the commission of misinformation. And most often, almost always, when the stories pertain to us, we are the last ones included or consulted or reached out for comment. We're not important. We're not the subject of our own stories. We're always the objects. We're always the people talked about. We are not the people doing the talking. I say this to say that every time you pick up the paper, every time you turn on the radio, every time you turn on the television, you have to be careful about the way you consume information. And you have to start out from the point of view that somewhere in there is an agenda. Now, some people would say, well, gee, you're preaching the doctrine of paranoia. And I would say, I agree with Adam Clayton Powell, that if you're black and you're not paranoid, you got to be crazy. You know, and even paranoids have real enemies. The idea is that we do have to be careful, because all the stuff that is going on here, you have to remember that for the most part, people in media are rather average. They're not especially gifted as you would think. And their ability to make sense of the world is limited. It is an unusual thing to really meet a bright reporter. They are encouraged in tacit ways and even in overt ways to play ball. The politics of the newsroom are governed by the agendas of the publishers. And if their agenda is real estate, in the city they will be friendly to the mayor. If their agenda is to perpetuate racist myths, they will do so. The newsroom will reflect that, which is why the New York Post, which is started by Alexander Hamilton himself, a man of color, although they never admit that, the New York Post's newsroom is as white today as it was in the 1930s. The idea is that there is the assumption that black people, people of African descent, people of color, Latinos and so forth, that their existence is really marginal. Our existence is really not critical to the functioning of our society. So they could take chances and shortcuts, and they could present Rudy Crew as a buffoon. And we know that he's not a buffoon. We may have strong disagreements with him. We may have some points of difference with the way he's approaching things. But we can agree that this is an educated man. He is not a buffoon. And the arrogance that these people take on to themselves to define the world, to tell you what is supposed to be important to you. This is all part of this journalistic mission that they're fulfilling. But it isn't a journalistic mission. It is a continuation of the racist status quo. It is a way of saying to you that no matter how conversant they are with the facts, they will continue to distort them, to hide them, to bury them, to ignore them, and to completely dismiss them if necessary, as in this story about few understanding what Rudy Crew is saying. So I just wanted to bring these stories to you to remind you that the mission that you have, the ongoing mission that you have, is to be highly suspect of the information you have access to and the information coming your way. Be very suspicious of it and subject it to intensive scrutiny. Thank you very much for allowing me to torture you, and I'll take questions or comments if you have any. Thank you. Oh, I was just informed that I'm breaking the great rule. There are no questions tonight. So I want to thank you very much for coming out and for making me feel, as usual, very much at home. Thanks so much.
Let's give Utrice a warm round of applause. Thank you very much. And before we rush out of here, let us all hold hands, please. We want to thank Utrice very much for coming out and giving that inspiring presentation on how to play defense with white media. And we certainly appreciate that. The only thing I wish, Utrice, is that some morning very soon I can turn on one of the black radio stations early in the morning and hear the voice of Utrice Leid. That would be a great moment, somebody who can give some sanity and clarity to our condition. We miss that, we need that. There's a lot of confusion now. I can only take about an hour every morning, then I go nuts. Since I live on the 7th floor, I have to lock the doors because otherwise I'll probably jump out of the window. That's how bad things are. So we really appreciate that. We really appreciate the presentation you gave tonight because it's very important. And what I would really suggest sometime, it would be good if we could go out early in the morning or late at night and buy some of these rags that some of our hosts discuss in the morning and be prepared for them. and teach them a lesson on how to read a newspaper in a defensive fashion. That would be very serious, and we really appreciate that. I hope that somebody might buy the tape and send it to some of our esteemed radio personalities so that they can be helped in their endeavor. And just one final point, Utrice, going back to the Rikers Guard story, there's one other question that really has to be raised in that particular story, which is very interesting, but I'm glad you put us on that focus, and that is the question of why it was the federal government rather than the district attorney of Queens County that brought the criminal actions, because it is a lot more difficult to prove federal civil rights violations in federal court than it is to prove assault charges in state court. And especially when you have a black as a defendant in federal court on civil rights violations, it's hard for a white jury to believe that one black could violate the civil rights of another black. So if this case go to trial, this would truly be a mock trial in terms of United States of America against Johnson, as the case might be. And we certainly appreciate all of that, because we need all of that, because it's the only thing that's going to get us out of this is intelligence. And the only way we're going to be effective activists or to be intelligent activists. That's the only way, and focused activists. That's the only way that we're going to ever sustain any kind of meaningful assault against white supremacy. We want to thank you very much for coming out, and we want to thank you, Utrice, for being in fine form as usual. We're an African people, robbed from our homeland, robbed of our names, our languages, our cultures, our religions, our selfhood, our nationhood, our womanhood, our manhood, our sisterhood, our brotherhood, our motherhood, our fatherhood, and our self-respect. But we shall rise, never to fall again. Up, ye mighty race. You can accomplish what you will. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Hug the person again and let them still know that you love them dearly. In the South, less than 70 high schools for blacks in the entire South. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida. That's very interesting. But, you know, and then I'm going to bring Utrice on, why that was important, because there was only 4 high schools in Georgia for blacks in 1900. There was only 4 public high schools for blacks in Georgia in 1900. And it always interested me. My mother graduated from McClellan Academy. She graduated from McClellan Academy. And in the year of her graduation, there were no black men in her class. All right? There were no black men in her class at McClellan Academy in the year of her graduation. And McClellan Academy was financed 100% by black folks in the community. All right? That's how serious our people were about education. And I was fortunate enough to see the school before it was torn down. McClellan Academy. was a boarding school to boot, because most of these people lived out in the country. So you couldn't go from Newton 20 miles every day out in the country on a mule and wagon. Because we were not fortunate enough to have cars then. As a matter of fact, in many instances, you couldn't own a car because of the sumptuary laws. See, the sumptuary laws said that Negroes can't live out of their place. White man caught you in an automobile, they put you behind bars. If you were driving anything but a mule and a wagon, you was in big trouble, because you had violated the sumptuary laws, because you were living beyond your means, which is you were living below the lowest white person. See, when you were growing up in the South, you had to first find out the poorest cracker in the community. And then you had to live below the poorest cracker. All right? All right, you had to live below the poorest cracker. If you were found living beyond the poorest cracker, you was in big trouble. All right? So you had to first find who the poorest cracker was in your community. And then you had to live lower than him. Otherwise, you was out of your place.
Yes, sir.
So this is the legacy that we have to deal with, and that's why we deal with these programs and these questions, because there's so much to our history that you don't even get. But now we got somebody here that's gonna make sure that we get how to read between the lines correctly.
All right, sir.
And there's nobody else better to do this than the 1995 recipient of the William Leo Hansberry Award of the United African Movement, and that is Sister Utrice Leid. Let us all stand up, please, and give a warm round of applause to our sister, Utrice Leid. Let's give it up for Sister Utrice Leid. Money watching a sellout. And so let us all again give a warm round of applause for our sister, one who we love so much, our teacher, Sister Utrice Leid.
Wow, it's good to be home. Well, we're going to do some reading tonight, but we're going to do some reading of a different sort. The idea is to read between the lies. It's a defensive mechanism, a mechanism of defensive reading. You know how good drivers are taught defensive driving? As a consumers of information, you have to do defensive reading, defensive hearing or listening, defensive viewing. And you have to do that because you have to understand, and I know you do, that this thing we call the media is really an extension of a white racist society. Its aim and objective largely, supposedly, is to inform. But the assumption there is that you're worth informing. You're not. Not as far as they're concerned. So things come our way. And with technological advances, they're coming our way faster And so the power to discriminate is thwarted sometimes because things are happening so quickly. You're forced to react at the pace at which they're presented to you. So you don't have time to do really intelligent and cognitive reception of information. You just take it all in. And at some point, maybe something would register with you, maybe a second thought would occur to you, maybe an apprehension will surface, but it is not always the case. And we have to be particularly careful about media because we know the link between information and power. I talk about that all the time. Sound information is the key to power, and therefore the absence of information or unsound information or disinformation or misinformation or no information is key to powerlessness. So with all that, we will begin our lessons for tonight. Everybody has some literature, I hope. And we will start with the story, a New York Times story, titled "Faulty Application of Paint is Cited in Stairwell Fires." Faulty application of paint is cited in stairwell fires. You have that? Okay. Is this visible? Oh, I gotta turn the lights on. Is it better? Okay, good. I'll give you about a fast 5 minutes to peruse the article. And then there will be a quiz. Appeared on page B2, that's the Metropolitan section of the New York Times, on January the 22nd, 1996. What you need to know is we'll talk about the aesthetics of the article. By the aesthetics, I mean, what is the treatment given this article? As you look at it, what strikes you about the article, just without even reading it? You'll notice, for example, that it is a two-deck headline, which means that it is pretty important, a pretty important story. You'll notice also, because I clipped it with that in mind, you see those two lines at the top? It is at the top of the page, which is to say, this is a pretty important article. It is placed at the top so that your eye can catch it right away. It is on page B2, which is a pretty important page. It is the first page on the inside as you open up the Metropolitan section. So in terms of position, the idea is to communicate to you that this is a very important story and you ought to read it. Again, the lines at the top, the placement, the actual physical placement of the article toward the top part of the paper, you have, and by the top part of the paper, because you know the New York Times is what is called a broadsheet. That is to say, it's a big paper. So at the top of the paper means even if you folded the paper, it will still be at the top of the paper. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. And it has a double headline, 2 lines. You'll notice also that there is a little thing called a pull quote that says, "Stairwell walls in arson fires had been improperly sanded." See that? That there is your pull quote, a pull quote, which is a phrase or a sentence or a couple of words extracted from the body of a story to augment the story, to highlight an important point of the story. But this pull quote says that the stairwell walls in arson fires had been improperly sanded, and that appears in one of the paragraphs. It's extracted from the paragraphs. So that's the aesthetic of the story. I didn't measure the story, but it looks like about 12 column inches in length. In other words, it's just 12 inches long. I would estimate this to be about what? 6 inches, 2 columns by 6 inches. That's pretty sizable for a little story. Now, what did you notice about this story? What is important to pay attention to is the last paragraph. Because that's where the story is. Responding to an article in the Daily News saying that the Housing Authority continued to use oil-based paint until last January, despite warnings from fire officials. You understand that? That's where the story is. That the city continued to use unsafe paint. It has nothing to do with the sanding of the walls. And you would notice that this fatal fire, which caused all of this controversy, occurred on December the 22nd. That's in your second paragraph. A great effort here is to set you up. In the first paragraph, the reporter says that the issue you ought to pay attention to is that fire and housing authority officials have finally solved the problem. They've analyzed what went wrong. They know what went wrong. And what went wrong was that the paint was improperly applied. They've solved the problem. This is very affirmative, very good news. And it is stated in the headline that it is almost a finding. A finding has been arrived at that the faulty application of paint is what the problem is. Okay, let's concede that. But that is not the story. The story is that despite the finding, they continued to use the same paint. And it doesn't take a genius to figure this out as the angle for a story. They've already found something. They've already determined what the issue is. But what I'm trying to show you here is how this reporter and the paper this reporter worked for chose instead to position the city in an affirmative light, despite the fact that it should be held accountable. Let's take a look. Look at the tone used in the first paragraph. Fire and housing authority officials said yesterday that they had determined what went wrong in efforts to protect. You see that word? To protect New York City's housing projects from a terrifying series of stairwell fires, and would complete the work in the most susceptible buildings this week. Now, after you read a paragraph like that, What registers, these are deliberately, carefully chosen words. They have determined it. In other words, they've conducted an aggressive investigation and there is a finding. They've determined what went wrong in efforts to protect New York City's housing projects. Now, I don't want to cast any aspersions on people, but it is not normally the expectation that any city official is interested in protecting people from anything. This reporter takes on the job of insisting that the fire commissioner and the housing commissioner are in the business of protecting people in the projects. And so that word is in there. Now, it may seem to you that I'm making a big fuss over a word, but I'm saying that the tone of the paragraph is already conciliatory. It is not about subjecting anybody to scrutiny. It is to excuse or to explain or to rationalize their inaction, because if they were interested in protecting people, then how do we explain the last paragraph? See? So, look at paragraph 5. The paragraph beginning with Ruben Franco, my main man.